I'd like to provide a short note here about the way that we use the word function. We say that something has a function, or we ask for functional explanations. And very often when we do so, it seems as if functions are simply there, as if that needed no further discussion. We can ask what's the function of this part of the brain, or such and such function. The perspective I'm going to give comes from the inactive approach to mind and life, but the considerations are very general. They're not limited to the inactive approach. They emerge from basic thinking about systems. We're going to start with a very simple example. If my car breaks down, then I'm going to want to fix it. And how do I know if my car is broken down? Well, when it no longer functions, I'll say it's broken down. There's an awful lot of things wrong with my car. At the moment, it has dents and dings and all kinds of cosmetic impurities, but it gets me from A to B, so I don't see the need to take it into the garage. But if it no longer gets me from A to B, then its basic function is no longer a given, and I'll need to repair it. And what repairing the car means in that instance then is to re-establish the function of getting me from A to B. So with that, we've put the word function in an everyday context as if we know how to use it. And in a scientific context, the word function is a little bit odd, because if we stick to the sciences of the inanimate, so physics and chemistry excluding organic chemistry, then the word function doesn't really ever appear. It doesn't seem right to ask what's the function of copper, what's the function of gravity. That's not to say that copper doesn't engage in a lot of interesting chemical combinations and that gravity doesn't hold us all down onto the earth. It's just that it seems a little odd to refer to those as functions. When we move into the realm of the animate, though, the living, the word function seems to occur quite naturally in our scientific descriptions, and the most obvious example is this one, of course. What's the function of the heart? Well, we have no difficulty describing the function of the heart. Its function is to pump blood around the body. That's fairly obvious, and it's been known for a long time. But when we say that the heart is for pumping blood, that word for requires a little careful attention. There's a background assumption here which licenses our use of the word for, or the expression of a function. We're assuming that we're talking about the integrity of a particular system, in this case the healthy human body. Absent that background assumption, there's no way to distinguish a working heart from a non-working heart. They're all just lumps of meat. We can identify the function because we take it as agreed that the integrity of the body is assumed in our conversation. Function requires this kind of framing. It's not the case that functions are simply there to be recognized. We need to do a little bit of work in framing our discussion. And if that's not quite clear, then maybe this might make it clearer. If we look at litter and we say, well, what's the function of litter? And most people would say, well, certainly when we compare it with the heart, we don't have a functional story of litter. We don't know what the function of litter is. And yet we could frame things, I think, such that litter would have a function. So if I run a recycling company, for example, litter is a very important part, perhaps, of the raw material which I process in order to make money. Or one could envisage a situation in which there's a national tidy towns competition, and my town is competing with the neighbouring town, and so at night, under cover of darkness, I sneak in and litter their town. Now the function of litter, from my perspective, is to get them to lose the tidy towns competition. A crow scavenging around might regard litter as an important source of food. It might play a functional role in the crow's nutritional ecology. So we can see that we can ascribe a function to litter. It just requires framing in each case. With chemicals, it's the same. Glucose is not inherently meaningful, and therefore it doesn't have a function without any further qualification. From a suitably disinterested perspective, glucose is not for anything, no more than copper or lead or anything else is from the inanimate world is for something. But if you happen to be a bacterium swimming in a glucose-rich medium, glucose is for metabolism in this instance. It's not a property of glucose, it's a relation between glucose and the dynamic complex organization that is a cell, a bacterial cell. So the function is not simply given, it demands that we simply frame our statements appropriately. As a side note, we'll notice that the word information is often misused in the same way. Information is not a free-flowing natural resource, and any invocation of information requires similar framing, which is usually overlooked. So function, I'll say here, is with respect to one domain or the other. And the function of the heart is referred to the role of the circulatory system in keeping the body alive. As we do this now, when we come to consider human experience and human behavior, we often address questions of function as if we knew what the domain in question was, what the framing was that licensed function. And sometimes it's the body, but very, very often it's not the body. And to see that, we just have to run a little thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that you woke up in the morning and you were blue. Now we'll assume, for the sake of argument, that this does not impact the functioning of your body. It has your liver isn't overworked as a result, your blood pressure doesn't change, you're simply blue. This might be an alarming thing to have happen to you. There are medical conditions that turn the skin blue and they're not welcome. So it's worth considering for a moment what disruptions would arise in your life as you went through your day blue. If you work, for example, dealing with the public, if you work on the teller in a bank, your employer might not be pleased that you turn blue. It might be considered to be an unwelcome distraction. If you were working in the food industry, for example, people might be reluctant to let you prepare their food because you don't very often encounter blue people, and who knows, maybe the blue is contagious. If you went to sit down in the subway, you might find people vacating the seat beside you. So clearly this blueness is having some kind of an impact on your life. You certainly have to explain an awful lot to a bunch of people. And you might find that it had a very serious negative impact. And yet the domain that's been impacted here is not the domain of the body. And if we were to undo the blueness, we wouldn't really be fixing the body, because by hypothesis the body is fine with being blue. So what system are we fixing if we undo this blueness? Well, here it becomes very important that we distinguish between the body, which is a well-defined skin-bound system, and the person, which is an awful lot of things, many of which are not coextensive with the body. So as people who live lives, we partake in very many systems. We are part of families, we are part of companies, universities, nations, football teams, traffic jams. We can take part in riots and lunch queues. We may be members of book clubs. We move in and out of these systems in the course of any given day. And the systems are, in some sense, not really external to us. Rather, they are things that we bring into being through our activity. That is to say, we co-constitute such systems. The body is one domain, but as a person, we seem to partake of very many domains. We co-constitute many systems. If that's not entirely clear, consider the distinction between a house and a household. You can enter or you can leave a house, but in doing so you do not become part of the house. A household is slightly different. A household arises through the activities of the people who live in a house. So the house is one of the framing conditions in order for there to be a household, but the household consists of the people and their activities that move around in the house. The household engages in certain activities such as paying utility bills, putting out the garbage and such. And the constituents of the household include you. So you co-constitute the household. And with this familiar example, we gain access to what otherwise might appear to be a lot of jargon. Here's a bit of jargon from the inactive world that talks about how we recognize a system in the first place. Imagine, if you will, we have a bunch of components, In the case of the household, this will include you. And these components interact so that they collectively give rise to or co-constitute a mutually sustaining set of linked processes. So we can identify the activity, the systemic activity in which all the participants engage as a set of mutually sustaining linked processes. Then we might, if we might be forgiven a bit of jargon, call this an autonomous dynamic system. Autonomous because we recognize that there's a lawfulness to the interaction of the components among themselves, and we can differentiate those from its environment, and we can discuss then the interactions between the system and its environment, but we can partition the entire universe into this system and what's not in this system. This is a good way of describing a cell, and this kind of jargon has its origins in systemic thinking about what life is. You can replace all the individual components of a cell and you still have the same cell, so its identity does not lie in the material constituents, but rather in the mutually sustaining set of linked processes, the dynamic processes that together constitute the activity of a living cell. But this language finds application far beyond such straightforward biological things. You might use this to describe the activity of a book club, for example, in which the constituents are the members of the book club. There are other things that are necessary, such as books, for example. The environment of a book club, in this case, would include the set of unread books. We shouldn't think of an environment here necessarily in simple physical, geographical, or spatial terms, but rather as the set of things which are outside the bounds of the system proper, but with which the system engages in regulated exchange. In that case, unread books constitute part of the environment of the book club. There are very many other collectivities that manage to display a persistent identity of some sort over time so that we can distinguish them from everything else. The body is one such. The human body is one such system in that sense, but a rugby scrum is another, a murmuration of starlings. Some of these systems may be very transient indeed. We may engage in a dialogue and come together in a conversation and have a mutually we can interact with each other on a reciprocal basis, tied together in real time, and thereby constitute a conversational system. And then we can leave that conversation and go on our ways, and I'm the poorer for having been part of this system. We need to have a language with which we can discuss the system and the components without confusing the two, and we need this to work in quite a formal sense. There is such a language available to us. It's the basic language with which mathematicians, physicists, and biologists discuss change over time, or dynamical systems. And in that vocabulary, we discuss the emergence of systems through the constrained interaction of components. Again, a readily understandable, visualizable example will help to cut through the jargon here. Here's a bunch of puppy dogs.
Scotty Pinwheel! Scotty Pinwheel!
Now, in this very simple example, the components we're talking about are 6 Scotty puppies. The emergent system is a pinwheel organization. The pinwheel is very real. It's a transient system which persists for a while, and it persists under certain conditions. In order for it to come about, we need individual components that are themselves self-driven. So we have autonomous systems, the dogs, excitable little chappies. We also need the right constraints. The constraint in this case is a circular feeding dish. And one of the conditions for the maintenance of this system is the regulated exchange of the system with its environment. In this case, that's the feeding behavior of the dogs. As long as we have that, then the pinwheel comes into being. The Scotty pinwheel comes into being. So We can use this as a reference example in order to recall how this jargon works. The pinwheel is an emergent system, as is a book club. The puppies are the components, and they have to be self-driven. They're not dead things. They are, each of them, a source of some activity. Through their interaction, under the appropriate constraints, we get the emergence of the pinwheel. And the maintenance of this demands a regulated exchange with the environment, which is the feeding. Now, when we combine these systems theoretic considerations with this vocabulary from dynamical systems, we get quite a powerful vocabulary that allows us to acknowledge the way in which, in our everyday life, we move among very many systems. The person is not coextensive with any one of these systems, not the body and not the book club. We develop a powerful vocabulary that allows us a bit of caution with respect to the discussion of the person. Systems like these never exist in a vacuum. They always have to engage in continuous reciprocal exchange with their environment. These kind of autonomous dynamical systems which emerge from the interaction, constrained interaction of autonomous components. What the bounds of the system are and what that environment is going to depend on what system we're talking about. Remember, we're not usually talking about a spatial environment or physical or even an ecological environment. In the case of a book club, the environment includes unread books. In the case of the puppy dogs, it includes undrunk milk. So different systems will necessarily require us to appeal to different environments. Now, when we've identified an autonomous dynamical system of this sort, we can consider two different perspectives. On the one hand, we have the perspective, a disinterested perspective, we could call it a godlike view, of a third party looking at the system from the outside. That's an observer's perspective. Then there's a second perspective, which is that of the system itself. And these are very interestingly different. Remember that bacterium swimming up the glucose gradient, for example. If we regard the cell as an autonomous system, an emergent system of the sort we just mentioned, we can now discuss the role of glucose in the continued existence of this system. So glucose is relevant to the health of the system. It plays a function in that domain. Observation of that is available to us from a disinterested third-person perspective. We can see this because we know an awful lot more than the cell knows. The cell knows nothing of glucose. The cell is merely swimming up the nutrient gradient. So this functional view is necessarily a view from the outside. It allows us to discuss systems from the outside and discuss the health of those systems. So we can ask, what are the conditions under which this system will persist? What conditions contribute to the sustained existence of this system? And under what conditions will this system no longer exist? Now, in order for that vocabulary to work, there has to be a system in the first place. So it must be a well-defined system of the sort that we've mentioned. And there has to be, any discussion of health is necessarily with respect to that system. It's not necessarily the same thing as health with respect to the components of the system. So the integrity of the system itself is a different thing than the interests of the components. A simple little example of this, taken here from North by Northwest, shows two people in a corridor.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
My fault. Sorry.
Now, those two people wanted to get past each other, so the interests of each was to pass by the other, but they became entangled in a form of dynamic interaction where the interaction developed its own momentum, and the persistence of the interaction was brought about by the actions of the components, but the maintenance of the system, the dyadic system, was not in the interests of either component. So we need to clearly distinguish between the interests of the system and the interests of the components. That's a little brief overview of the term function, and when we use the term function, we should bear this in mind. The function always presupposes some framing, systemic framing. Thank you.